Washington, D.C.
Based on their actions over the last week or two, they're not doing a service to the people. And I think more than anything else is I got to know them. And I'm not sure I want to make a deal with them. We can play games, but I'm not sure I want to make a deal. Let's just finish the job.
Breaking tonight, ceasefire over. The U.S. launching strikes on Iran for a second straight day, reviving fears of a wider war, briefly sending oil above $80 a barrel, all of it unfolding against the backdrop of the NATO summit, as we'll discuss with former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Plus, Patriot production. The president today announcing he will allow Ukraine to build its own Patriot interceptor missiles, a potential game changer for Kyiv after another wave of Russian missile attacks. But the promise may run into a hard reality: global shortages, complex supply chains, and major production hurdles. And it's Party versus Platner, Maine's Democratic Party, urging Graham Platner to withdraw from the U.S. Senate race after allegations of sexual assault. Party officials now accusing Platner's team of trying to influence the process of choosing a replacement. The campaign saying it only wants clarity over how the decision would be made. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And, Joe, we begin with the breaking news. The U.S. Central Command confirming in the last hour a new round of strikes against Iran, something President Trump warned would probably happen earlier today while at the NATO summit in Ankara. And we begin there with Bloomberg's AnneMarie Hordern, who's joining us live from Turkey, where she's tracking these new developments. So 2 days in a row, AnneMarie, what do we know about what these strikes were targeting and where things go from here?
Yeah, another night of strikes where the president put that possibility on our radar earlier, and then hours after he departed the NATO summit, those strikes began, according to CENTCOM. In a statement, they said the forces have started conducting these additional strikes at the direction of the commander-in-chief and is to further degrade their ability in terms of Iran to threaten freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Axios is reporting that it's air defense systems and coastal radar that the United States is going after right now. We should be on notice as well for the remainder of the evening. The Iranians say that they will respond to these strikes as well. And it comes at the backdrop of this story absolutely overshadowing the NATO summit when the president earlier in the morning said that he was over the ceasefire. The ceasefire doesn't exist anymore. Even if negotiators wanted to continue talking, it was a waste of time. Then when pressed at the news conference about, well, is this just a resumption of war? He said no, he doesn't think it's going to really start up again. But here we are with the president departing the NATO summit and strikes once again on Iran.
One of the biggest pieces of news.
A little birdie told me this. About the fact that we'll give them the right to make Patriots. We'll show them how to do it. It's very complex, actually, but it's you'll figure out the complexity quickly. So one of the things we're going to be talking about is we're going to give a license to you to make Patriots. That's pretty cool, right?
Larry?
This way you can't complain.
The president there, in another moment during the NATO summit, really broke major news and a massive win for President Zelensky, who came into this meeting really urging the NATO alliance and the United States to provide more Patriot air defense missiles. He needs this in order to fend off the strikes, especially some recent, fresh, acute strikes on Kyiv and on the remainder of the country. And they're really unable to fend some of these. They feel like they don't have enough hardware. This has been in motion for months as a discussion, and the president broke the news there before he had this meeting with President Zelensky, saying that this is what they'd like to see. They are going to allow this Patriot missiles to be produced on Ukrainian soil. A lot of details still need to be worked out, but a lot of European allies and the NATO alliance writ large was very welcoming of this development.
Important news coming from the NATO summit. AnneMarie, thank you so much. We're lucky to have you there. Bloomberg's AnneMarie Hordern traveling with the president, joining us live from Ankara. With us now for more on this is Ambassador Kurt Volker, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO under Presidents George W. Bush and Obama, and the former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations under President Trump. I'd like to start with Iran, if we can. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We'd like to talk about both of these items with you. Based on what you heard today, the rhetoric from President Trump, is the MOU no longer Or is this simply the new normal, where we every couple weeks go through this tit for tat with Iran?
Right. I think the MOU, it was never the be all and end all. It was kicking a lot of things down the road. It was vague on the Strait of Hormuz. Iran was claiming that after 60 days they would control the strait anyway. But I think it served both sides' interest in terms of ending hostilities and bringing global markets, oil prices, gasoline prices back to normal levels. Now, Iran started playing games with that, and they attacked some ships in the Persian Gulf, trying to force shipping through the Iranian territorial waters rather than through the Omani side. That is not in the spirit of the MOU, so President Trump pushed back very hard on that. And I think what he wants to do is resume some strikes, knock the Iranians back a little bit to get them back into compliance with allowing open shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. I think if he can get that, he's prepared to let the rest sit for a while and deal with the nuclear issue down the road.
Well, but how will the nuclear issue be dealt with if the president is suggesting that there's no point in talking to the Iranians? Are they not credible negotiation partners? Is he right in that?
Right. No, they're not. And we learned that from the many negotiations that other administrations have had with the Iranians. They lie at every turn. They conceal their program. They try to develop nuclear weapons regardless. They're going to do that whether they reach something in an agreement or not. What we have done is take strikes against Iran to really knock back their nuclear program by a long way. It's going to be time-consuming and difficult for them to reconstitute it. And we have to keep monitoring them. We have to press them as best we can to get inspectors in there. We have to get intelligence sources in there. We have to see with our own eyes what is happening and be prepared to strike them again if they make progress on a nuclear program.
Ambassador, early reports on the strikes that we're seeing underway right now include radars, missile positions, air defense systems that seem to be lining the Strait of Hormuz. The administration has repeatedly told us, the president himself, that Iran's capability for counterstrike has been decimated. He says we eliminated their Air Force and the Navy. Save for a couple of small Mosquito boats, that remains the threat. Can you help us understand how Iran still presents such a threat to shipping and to the U.S. Navy in the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, well, first off, the statement that we've eliminated everything is an exaggeration. They still have some missiles. They fired at Gulf states and U.S. bases in the region just the other day, so they can do that. But the most important factor is that it takes a lot less to deny access to the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz than it does to control it. So all the Iranians have to do is hit one major vessel, one oil tanker or one other major cargo ship, and the insurers are going to say, oh, this is too risky, we don't want to insure this. The shippers are going to say, we'd better wait. So it doesn't take much for the Iranians to shut things down. It takes a lot more for us or anyone else to force them open. And that's how the Iranians are continuing to play this game.
Well, let's talk about that anyone else. The president has been vocal for months in his criticisms of our European allies and NATO allies in particular around what he felt should have been them stepping up to secure the Strait of Hormuz and allow it to be free and open for commercial shipping. He echoed some of that at the NATO summit over the last few days, renewed his criticisms over Greenland as well, over defense spending. Was any progress made at this NATO summit, Ambassador?
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, I mean, President Trump says these things when someone pushes his button. So some reporter asked him about Greenland. So, of course, that's what he said. But the reality is there's no new push going on Greenland. We have bilateral talks going on with Denmark. Denmark is providing support for the military in Greenland, and they're also providing welfare for the local population. So that's not a major issue there. Defense spending, he came away quite successful. I think he was quite happy with the amount of new spending that NATO countries are doing overall. He's just singling out a few of the laggards like Spain. But I think at the end of the summit, he pushes and pushes and pushes, and then he was taking credit for actually having achieved a good result. And on Iran, I think he had good mood music there. I think Secretary General Rutte was very supportive. Other NATO leaders were supportive. And I think if we get to a point where we need to do something to restore or at least to maintain freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, he'll have allies that are going to want to try to help. That's very different than when we started this off in February. We didn't tell anybody we were attacking. Then we complained that they weren't attacking with us. Then we wanted to use facilities. Nobody knew what the ask was, what it was for, where this was going. I think now with some real consultations at NATO and some of the back and forth we've had, we're much more on the same page.
Ambassador, you have such deep experience with Ukraine, and I think we can argue that some of the biggest news, if not the most important headline to come from this summit, was the president's announcement today to extend the Patriot missile licenses to Ukraine. Is this the game changer that we've been told it will be?
Well, look, there is never any single game changer. You know, we went through that with ATACMS. We went through that with long-range systems and so forth. But they all accumulate. And this is very important. Over the last 6 months, Ukraine has decidedly taken a military advantage in drone attacks on the front lines, counter-drone air defense, electronic warfare, long-range strikes inside Russia, medium-range strikes on Russian logistics. Ukraine is taking an advantage on all those areas. But where they are vulnerable is fast missile strikes on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. And these would be cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. The only system really reliable for taking those out is the Patriot missile system. And Ukraine right now is out of ammunition for that. That's why the Russians are hitting the cities so successfully. Now, there's a global shortage of Patriot missiles, so President Trump doesn't want to take away from us or take away from the Gulf allies, but a solution where we allow Ukraine to produce them on their own under a U.S. license will put more of these on the global market, which is needed anyway, and they will become available for Ukraine. It's going to take a few months to get this going, but it's very, very significant, and this is something that Vladimir Putin's going to take notice of.
Well, yeah, what signal does this send to the Kremlin, and does it incentivize Vladimir Putin to show up to the negotiating table?
Well, this is what a lot of the effort recently has been, the long-range strikes, the hits on the oil refineries, the oil export capacity. It's to demonstrate to Russia that their situation is getting worse and they should go for a ceasefire. Ukraine would take a ceasefire today, but Russia has been resisting that. Putting these Patriot missile manufacturing capabilities in Ukrainian hands is going to make Ukraine even more resilient, and they will continue the strikes to degrade Russia's oil export capacity, their finances, and the soldiers on the front lines. So this just adds on to that pressure on Putin, where he's going to have to take a ceasefire at some point.
Let's talk Turkey while you're with us, Ambassador. Pretty important decision the president has to make involving the F-35. And he sure seems to be indicating that he wants to give access, once again, restore access to the program for the Turks. First of all, does Turkey deserve this? Is there a way to unwind the S-400 to make that somehow acceptable? And what do the other members of the alliance say? To what extent will the president be offending them if this does happen?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a technical question as to what can be done with the S-400, and it needs to be addressed. And you're going to have members of Congress saying, look, it's debatable whether we should give them the F-35 access or not, but we can only do it if we eliminate the risk that the S-400 presents. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of whether it's in our interest to have Turkey with F-35 aircraft, I would argue that it is. We share a common interest in many troubled parts of the world, including in Syria, including in Lebanon, including in Iran, Iraq, Black Sea. And I think that this it will be helpful for Turkey to have that capability. It'll also help keep Turkey in the fold in NATO, because the F-35 is really the NATO standard aircraft anymore, and they will be a part of that. And it will give the U.S. more influence and more engagement with Turkey as we would deploy a system like that inside Turkey, rather than seeing the U.S. and Turkey drift apart.
All right, Ambassador, we'll leave it there. Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you so much for joining us. And the flare-up in tensions between the U.S. and Iran that we were just discussing with the ambassador sent stocks lower and oil surging today, though both moves had moderated somewhat by the close. For the details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins live from World Headquarters in New York. Nora.
Well, equity started off on the right foot, but that was until about midday when we did see comments from Trump on Iran and what's going on in the Middle East. But we did see buyers stepping back into the market. We did see both the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100 actually both hitting record highs. That was right before the close. So we did see the S&P 500 was actually unable to hold those gains. So the S&P 500 lost about 0.3% at the closing bell. But under the hood there, we did see about 391 stocks that were in the green. Some of those winners actually being Nvidia, Broadcom. Of course, we also saw chip makers really pushing forward up about 2%. So that did give a bit of a boost to the Nasdaq 100, which did end higher by about 0.3%. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, though, it did fall about 1.1%. And some of those economically sensitive stocks that are in the Russell 2000 were lower by a little bit less than 1%. And a look over at the bond market, we did see treasuries were weaker, yields modestly higher. We are seeing this really led by the front end of the curve. So the 2-year treasury yield currently at about 4.21%. That's lower by about 3 basis points. And we do see the 10-year treasury yield, that benchmark, at 4.57%. And on the long end of the curve, looking at the 30-year, up about 5.07% on the yield there. So some of those higher yields just really pointing to potential tighter financial conditions. And in the oil market, which we know has really been the center of this entire story, we do see Brent crude higher by more than 7%. Earlier topping, hanging around $80 a barrel, now still sitting around that. Of course, we do know in the post-market trade, though, we did get this headline about the U.S. beginning additional strikes on Iran. So we'll have to see how it continues to impact markets here.
Could be another interesting day tomorrow. Nora, thank you. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda live from New York. Coming up, the Maine Democratic Party and Graham Platner's campaign publicly feud as he's being urged to drop his Senate bid, with reports he will speak on his future tonight. We'll have more with former Obama campaign manager Jim Messina next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The Maine Democratic Party has been working around the clock to develop a process to replace our U.S. Senate nominee that is open, inclusive, transparent, and fair. The integrity of this process is just as important as the outcome, and we are committed to ensuring that Democrats across our state can have confidence in both. Unfortunately, Graham Platner's team has repeatedly reached out to us in an attempt to put their thumb on the scale of what this process looks like.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was Devin Murphy-Anderson, executive director of the Maine Democratic Party, saying Graham Platner will not play a role in the process of selecting a new candidate to replace him on the ballot, though he still has not yet officially dropped out of the race. Joining us now for more is Democratic campaign veteran Jim Messina, founder and CEO of the Messina Group, who ran President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. Jim, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you back on Bloomberg. Is even more damage being done by Graham Platner's prolonging of this, what looks to be an ultimate dropout here in all likelihood, and fighting publicly with the Maine Democratic Party about it?
Well, it depends on how long it lasts, Kaylee. Graham Platner's career in politics is done, whether he realizes it or not. And when you've caused all this, you and your campaign don't get to decide who the nominee is. When you've lied to the press and the public of Maine for months, you don't get to decide who the nominee is. And when you ran a campaign that didn't fully vet your candidate, you don't get to decide who the nominee is. So the only people that should decide who the nominee is the voters in Maine and the Democrats in Maine. And they're going to run an open, transparent process, and I think that's exactly right. Sadly, as you and Joe know more than anyone, we Democrats have a little experience in replacing our nominees in the middle of a cycle after 2024. What we learned here is we need an open, very clear process, and the candidate doesn't get to pick.
Okay, so let's say for just the sake of this conversation, Jim Messina, Graham Platner goes back to eating oysters. A new candidate is selected, and you get to run the campaign. You're the campaign manager. What do you do to get out of this and give Democrats a chance to flip the seat?
You go straight back to the grassroots. You campaign in every single county in Maine. You reintroduce yourself. You understand that this is a state that is independent, and you represent that moment. The reason Susan Collins continues to win in a state that Kamala Harris carried by 7 points is she does better with women voters, especially in the Portland metro market. And so you pick someone who can have a conversation with those voters and say, this is very clear what this election is about. It's about Susan Collins having been there way too long, and it's about a new change. And that's how you campaign straight to the grassroots and stop all this kind of national politics.
Well, but if you consider the map nationally, knowing Maine is kind of a must-pick-up seat for the Democrats if they want to flip the Senate, would you be targeting spending more money in Maine or diverting more to some of the other races, Texas or Iowa or Ohio, to kind of bolster your chances in case Maine is, in fact, out of reach?
I agree with Kayleigh's earlier statement. I don't think there's a lot of scenarios in which the Democrats can carry the United States Senate without winning Maine. Like you can figure it out. And I run 60-some thousand simulations of the election, Kayleigh, and there aren't a lot where you don't need Maine. And so, we're talking about states right now like Texas, like Ohio, like Alaska, where Democrats lost by double digits. Then you're talking about Maine, where we won by 7 points. It's just hard to believe you'd win those states and not win Maine.
All right. Wow. So we've talked about a lot here. Jim, should there be a primary to give voters a sense that they played a role in this, or is time so tight the party needs to make a deal and come up with a new nominee?
Because of the time frame, Joe, because of when the ballots are going out, because of, basically you have to have a nominee by the second week in August. There's no time and no process for a primary. What is true is there is time and process for the Democratic Party to make decisions, to run, grassroots discussions, to talk to voters, to talk to people. It doesn't need to be done in a closed door, but I don't think there's a scenario in which they can go to a primary given the state law.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the party right now more generally, Jim, and the open fissures that seem to be emerging with the progressives or the Democratic Socialists versus the establishment apparatus, most of it already in Washington, how did they put themselves back together in time to coalesce around a coalition in November?
Well, the great thing is we have Donald Trump, and Donald Trump unites Democrats together. Like, they are very clear the most important thing is winning either the House or the Senate to put a check on all this corruption that Democrats see happening every single day. And so I think you'll have a united Democratic Party because people understand you have to win this seat. And so I'm not as worried about uniting the party. I think both parties are really split down, in some really ideological lanes. The Dems, as you just talked about, the Republicans have the same fight with traditional George Bush Republicans versus MAGA Republicans. Winning an election means you hold your base together and then go talk to the swing voters that we all know decide these elections.
I'd love to talk to you about this a lot more because I'm sure this will be something that drives through the campaign, Jim. It's great to have you back. Jim Messina with us live on Bloomberg. Coming up next, we return to the breaking news this evening. Happening right now, new airstrikes against Iran. Just hours after President Trump declared the moratorium, a memorandum, I should say, of understanding dead. The ceasefire over. We'll discuss the resumption of hostilities with retired Lieutenant General David Deptula. Coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with breaking news. For the second straight night, the U.S. is launching new strikes against Iran as President Trump returns home from the NATO summit. He's on his way now. The risk of re-escalation in the Middle East, combined with the U.S. withdrawal of sanctions waivers on Iranian oil, pushing oil higher today, briefly sending Brent crude above $80 a barrel. A big move, raising fears that A wider conflict could send gasoline prices higher, diesel, put fresh pressure on inflation for consumers and businesses. For more on all of this and the fallout from Iran, we're joined by Bloomberg Economics' Chris Kennedy, who specializes in economic statecraft and has been bringing great analysis daily since this all began on the terminal and online. And Chris, it's great to have you back. I don't know if this most recent round of strikes changes your grander view on things, but there is a thought that this is the new normal that we're in. Aaron David Miller told us that earlier today, Kayleigh, that every couple of weeks we go through this tit for tat. Oil will eventually fall back. Do you see that or a greater risk of escalation?
Yeah, Joe. So our base case is still that we are in that sort of escalation and then de-escalation period.
Yep.
But, of course, these are pretty significant attacks 2 nights in a row. Iran is taking hits to some of their missile stockpiles, et cetera. And I think there is a risk that we will see some retaliation from Iran that could do some more lasting damage to export infrastructure, to oil production and gas production infrastructure in the Gulf. And that would, of course, have much longer term impacts on energy security.
Well, so when the president says things like he did at the NATO summit today, that oil prices have come down, we'll see if they stay down, you would be betting that perhaps that will not be the case.
That's a great question, Haley. I think it's hard to say. I will say that, right now we do have a lot of oil on the market. Right now we're still getting releases from emergency, stockpile releases from the U.S., for instance. But we are still in a very influx energy situation globally. In the U.S., we're seeing gasoline inventories drop to their lowest seasonal level since 2012. Diesel inventories are down. There's a lot of pressure on these products that really do, set the tone for consumers in America and around the world.
So let's talk a little bit more about what that retaliation could mean if Iran does start to strike its neighbors. I presume you're talking about capacity or infrastructure in Qatar, in UAE, where already they've done some damage to LNG production. What could that mean if we saw a real increase, a real escalation by Iran against those targets?
Yeah, so I don't want to overplay it too much.
Understood.
Because certainly, Iran, I think, doesn't want to go back into a full-fledged conflict, and either does the U.S. But we're entering the period where you expect Europe to be, increasing stocks of natural gas and other products ahead of the winter season. It could cause real problems, especially for non-U.S. economies that do rely on imports from the Gulf as the weather gets colder. The U.S., of course, has a glut of natural gas. That wouldn't be a major problem for the U.S. domestic market, and we can't export very much because of our export capacity. But it could cause real problems around the world.
But when you add Russia to the situation, Kayleigh, we've been talking a lot about that.
Yep.
And just today, Russia's suggesting banning diesel exports and delaying repairs to refineries that Ukraine's having a good time shooting at.
Yes, absolutely. Ukraine's been very effective in targeting oil and gas infrastructure and export and tankers, Russian tankers, over the past several months, and that shows no signs of slowing down.
Well, we just had a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal, Chris, that I'll bring to our audience. Kevin Warsh, the newly minted chairman of the Federal Reserve, will be testifying before the Senate Banking Committee next week, July 15th, for the annual monetary policy report. So Humphrey Hawkins, I guess, is on the calendar.
Yes.
We were wondering when this would happen. How would you expect Kevin Warsh or the Fed more largely to be looking at this current situation? When we got minutes today that suggested the Fed at the last meeting was thinking the inflationary risks were more to the upside, does the renewed hostility lend credence to that argument?
I think so. And I think what we saw today is that this Fed is pretty satisfied with the employment situation, but they do see upside risk to prices from both energy, but also the AI build out. And of course, any additional upside push on energy prices is just going to, I think, elevate the hawkish voices on the Federal Open Market Committee.
All right. Well, that should be fun testimony next Wednesday. Bloomberg's Chris Kennedy from Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much, as always, for your analysis. And joining us now for more on the state of play from the Middle East to Ukraine is retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula. General, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could begin with the renewed strikes that are underway again for a second night against Iranian targets this evening. How does the U.S. avoid this spiraling into an escalatory cycle?
First, Kayleigh and Joe, it's great to be back on with you. I think what you're seeing is that Iran has answered diplomacy with attacks. So what the president's move is not necessarily escalatory, but he is imposing consequences that are militarily decisive, economically painful, and politically unmistakable. So, I wouldn't characterize that as escalation. I'd characterize it as a smart reaction, because Tehran needs to understand that every violation is going to make its situation worse, not better. What I would share with you is that Iran's latest attacks should end any illusion that Tehran intends to comply with the memorandum simply because it signed one. So the U.S. objective should not be another paper understanding. It needs to be coercive pressure that changes Iran's behavior. And that's what we need to be focused on, not escalation per se.
Understood. General, when we have instances like this, and as you know, we've seen a lot of tit-for-tat strikes, retaliatory strikes on both sides since the ceasefire was first established. If we know where to strike in those instances, including tonight, why hasn't the president authorized a strike on all of their capabilities to eliminate all Iranian leverage?
Well, it's a good question. And what you're getting at is the heart of the attack plan that Central Command has put together to be able to respond to the president's direction. And so,
is Iran rebuilding between these strikes?
I'm sorry?
Is Iran rebuilding between these strikes? Is that how we're finding additional targets, or are we saving some for leverage?
No, it's an issue of magnitude and what can be targeted to increase consequences to these Iranian MOU violations. So what I'd suggest is going on is we're moving from compliance by negotiation to compliance by denial and punishment. And so, there's still a variety. Remember, if you go back to what the president and Central Command has conveyed when the original attacks were halted to set up this ceasefire, is the complete target plan had not been executed. So what you're seeing unfolding now is a reimposition and expanding maritime pressure around Iranians' export nodes and striking IRGC naval, missile, drone, radar, and command and control assets that are tied to these attacks on shipping or U.S. forces. So what is going on is the U.S. is making clear that every Iranian attack is going to expand the target set.
Well, and we just got a fresh Truth Social post from President Trump, who said these attacks are, quote, retribution for Iran striking ships in the Strait of Hormuz. He says if it happens again, it will get much worse, to the point you were just making, General. Right. But what of Iran's nuclear program specifically? Because the ceasefire period was supposed to allow for negotiations over Iran's nuclear future. The president at the NATO summit today suggested that the U.S. already has bombed their nuclear sites to such an extent that no one is able to get to that remaining enriched uranium. Only the U.S. could get it, and if anyone tried to, he said, we would just blow them up. Can the U.S. guarantee that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon from the air alone?
Well, it's an interesting question, and first I think it's unrealistic, and it's not part of the U.S. planning process to put together a plan that just relies on application of force from one domain alone. That's sort of the antithesis of U.S. joint doctrine, where the U.S. elects to use what is the most appropriate force at the right time in the right place, with respect to denying Iran's ability to capitalize on its nuclear stockpile or materials that have been isolated now. Ultimately, those have to be removed. And so that has to be done on the ground. It can be done in a variety of different ways. It can be done by the Iranians removing them themselves, under UN overwatch. It can be done by movement of U.S. forces into the country, and we remove them ourselves. But ultimately, enriched uranium needs to be removed. So there are a variety of different ways that can be done.
General, a little bit out of the blue with this question, but I'd love your input on something we heard today from the administration, and that was a decision to fly the president home on the old Air Force One, or one of the old Air Force Ones, knowing that he took the new gifted Qatari jet on the trip to Ankara. There were questions, realizing he posted that he wanted troops in the UK to get a tour of the new plane. There were questions about whether it had been secured properly and could be trusted to be flown around the Middle East, because he took some time at a news conference today to say that I'm number one, as he said, on the kill list for Iran. We know that there are Iranian assassination teams going after Donald Trump, and we know that this airplane originally came from Qatar. What do you make of this decision to send the president home on the old jet?
Well, I think, Joe, just like you said, the most likely explanations are security, survivability, communications, or operational caution. Just like you just articulated, is given the renewed U.S.-Iran exchange and the threats on his life. So President Trump flew home from Turkey on an older VC-25A today, rather than the new 747 retrofitted aircraft. And there are a variety of different reasons. I mean, and here they are, security and survivability. That older VC-25 aircraft was specifically built and maintained for presidential command, control, secure communications, and survivability. So, it's operating as a national command platform. Number two, the defensive systems, there are reports that the newer 747 bridge aircraft may not have the same level of missile detection and countermeasure systems as the older jets just yet. Another option is secure communications. Same thing, may not have all of those changes input yet. And then there's operational prudence. But the threats from the Iranians, the prudent choice is to use the most proven platform for the commander-in-chief. And then finally, what I'd share with you is we really shouldn't expect the White House to disclose the real operational reasoning if it involves aircraft vulnerabilities or other threat assessments.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, General, but with everything you just said, it sounds like you're suggesting that maybe the president shouldn't have ridden on that plane to Turkey in the first place.
It's a judgment call on the basis of what you and I really don't know in the context of the differing systems that I just talked about, and to what degree those have either already been placed on the new aircraft or not just yet. So the fact of the matter is, when the president's flying during a military crisis, Air Force One isn't the luxury aircraft. It's an airborne command post. So you use the platform with the highest confidence, not the newest paint job.
He was the principal attack planner of the Desert Storm Coalition air campaign and orchestrated air operations over Afghanistan following 9/11. Also used to fly an F-15 fighter jet. Retired Lieutenant General David Deptula, thank you, sir, for joining us, as always.
Thank you.
Coming up, Graham Platner is still in the race for Senate in Maine. That could change as soon as tonight. We'll have more ahead with our political panel on balance of power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Graham Platner's career in politics is done, whether he realizes it or not. And when you've caused all this, you and your campaign don't get to decide who the nominee is. When you've lied to the press and the public of Maine for months, you don't get to decide who the nominee is. And when you ran a campaign that didn't fully vet your candidate, you don't get to decide who the nominee is. So the only people that should decide who the nominee is the voters in Maine and the Democrats in Maine.
Why beat around the bush? It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew, having just spoken with former Obama campaign manager Jim Messina, weighing in there on the fate of Graham Platner's campaign for U.S. Senate in Maine, or whatever's left of it. Joining us now, our political panel, Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden, and Republican strategist Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group. Great to have you both back together again. Megan, I'll start with you, as this is a family conversation for Democrats right now. What's happening inside this campaign? The Maine Democratic Party says they're trying to thumb the scale. Platner says he just wants to understand what the process will be to replace him.
Come on, I'm sorry.
Does he drop out tonight?
I don't know if he drops out tonight. I heard that he was going to speak.
Yeah.
He needs to drop out. If we've learned anything, the longer that you take to drop out, the worse it is going to get for you. Also, your consultants who are misguided here. This kid is 26 years old. He has no business dictating to the state party. It is just showing how selfish they are. They do not care about winning the majority. They care about themselves and Graham Platner. It's the same people that are giving us Abdul al-Sayed in Michigan, which is also the Senate majority is contingent on winning. So I just think that people need to take a hard look at some of these candidates that these folks are putting forward. They are not vetted. They lie. I mean, he's accused of rape. Like, what? Goodbye. Like, I just see yourself out.
Of course, he denies those allegations. His campaign has also suggested, Megan, that they want to make sure that this process is transparent. And I wonder if this is in some ways due to the fact that in 2024, when Joe Biden dropped out, it was an anointing of Kamala Harris. There was no next primary process. No one else really had a say. Do Democrats need to not repeat that mistake potentially?
I think that the voters of Maine did vote for him, but they didn't have all the facts. And I think that is a problem here. This campaign lied over and over again to the people of Maine, and they misrepresented who they were. And that is a really unfortunate position that the state of Maine is now being put in, and there needs to be transparency. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't actually think that the Democratic Party in Maine knows what that looks like. I think they're trying to figure that out with the help of the National Party, and I hope that they find a transparent way. But what I do know is you possibly just cost the Democrats the majority in the Senate, because we had a chance to beat Susan Collins, who is the #1 target for Democrats, and because you people couldn't vet your candidate, and because your candidate is so just lied. I mean, it is so upsetting to me, and I've not been a Graham Platner fan for a long time. It is just really upsetting to me because candidate selection matters, and the Democratic Party and the people of Maine and the voters deserve better.
As passionate as we've ever seen you at this table. You want us to just keep talking about Megan? Because we can keep doing that.
Republicans should just shut up.
Well, that's the game, though, right?
and let Democrats.
Are comparisons to Ken Paxton out the window now? Has he topped the nominee from Texas?
Well, I think all the Paxton stuff we knew about previously, and it had been litigated and had been reviewed, and he won elections after that. Yeah. And so I think, may have a little bit of a different aspect here. The stuff on Platner does seem pretty terrible, and I know it's
heavy-duty
not necessarily proven, but it's bad news. For me, the more interesting thing is kind of watching the Democrats go through what Republicans went through 10 years ago, where it's the grassroots versus the establishment.
Tea Party.
It's the folks who are willing to turn out to vote for someone who's going to fight, versus establishment vetted candidates. This is tough stuff, and both parties now are kind of in this star chamber and trying to figure out the best way forward. And it doesn't look great, I got to say.
To be fair, though, Republicans also, this is an anti-incumbent cycle. Republicans have lost some really good Republican candidates that they had that are more of the establishment. So I think this is just the voters saying what's going on in Washington doesn't work. We don't trust what's going on there, and we want a whole different group of people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, so then when we consider the fact that prior to all of this kind of imploding in Maine, Democrats were feeling pretty confident that they at least had a chance of flipping the Senate, where they might not have earlier, due in part to the fact that gas prices had risen because the president launched major combat operations in Iran. Did Susan Collins or any Republican, frankly, get good news on one front and bad news on another, as we're now in a second day of strikes? That's not what you want to see if you're an incumbent that has to answer for the decisions of this administration, right?
Well, the president is clearly on the hot spot to manage the end of this Iran conflict in a way that does minimal damage to Republican candidates. And I got to say, so far, he's handled that fairly well. We're seeing, the stock market, oil prices. He's demonstrated an ability to affect those things on an almost hour-by-hour basis, which is an amazing phenomenon. And if in fact if we get to November and Democrats aren't able to win in this moment, it is going to be one of the great lost opportunities of all time, and it'll be in part because of in fairness to President Trump, and I'm not his best supporter, in large part due to President Trump's amazing political abilities and ability to kind of manage messages on almost, several times a day in different venues to kind of control the narrative.
He held 3 news conferences today. Yeah. If you put them together, we're talking about a few hours here, I think, of the president speaking off the cuff. If gasoline, as it likely will, we've got crude back touching $80 a barrel today. Gasoline gets back above $4. People start to make opinions around Labor Day. Does that guarantee the blue wave?
I don't think there's going to be a blue wave regardless. No. I think Democrats will take back the House. I think it will still be a slim majority. But I do think that Democrats need to focus on their message of solutions. And you can focus on what Donald Trump is doing. And gas prices and affordability is a main issue. But Democrats need to show the American people and their voters that we have solutions when we do take power. Because why would you want to give someone power that has not performed for you before just 2 short years ago? Yeah. And I think that's a problem that the Democrats are facing right now. And again, candidate selection and finding people that work in your communities is of the utmost importance.
I do want to note that Air Force One, the old Air Force One, the light blue Air Force One, just touched down in the UK at Mildenhall Air Force Base for a refueling stop as the president travels back from Turkey here. The new Air Force One, the dark navy blue, is also going to this base for the troops to tour it, apparently, because the president, Lester, couldn't fly home on it. What message does that send that the brand new plane he rode over to Turkey is not the plane that he's returning on?
Listen, before you go buy the new car and it's flashy and it looks great parked on the curb, do a test drive. Yeah. Make sure you like the interior. Make sure it's drivable. Make sure you fit in the driver's seat. That's a big thing for me. You got to do a test drive. And it seems to me like President Trump may have done his test drive. He's like, maybe I don't really like this plane.
Or maybe
let's go use the old one.
Maybe the message is, Megan, don't buy used. You spent a lot of time on that baby blue Air Force One. What are we talking about here?
Just in fairness to the Trump administration, whenever you fly overseas, you always have a backup plane. So the 2 Air Force Ones traveling, that is not unusual. So we don't know why he's not on the new Air Force One. I would venture to guess it's because it's not as secure, or there's not the same capabilities that the old Air Force One has. And when we're striking Iran and doing some other things and you're in Turkey, you might want to have different capabilities. That's a great question. You'd have to ask the Trump administration. I'm sure it's a vanity project, but I don't know. But I do think that there's probably some reasons why he's on the old Air Force One.
Yeah.
All right.
This is a story, maybe.
Yeah, and one we'll continue to explore. Megan Hayes and Lester Munson, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And for more coverage of everything from Air Force One to the conflict with Iran, to the drama in Maine as we see Democratic Party infighting on full display, you can check out the Washington edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Yeah, he's going to be speaking tonight, or at least putting up a video. We'll have all of that and talk about it tomorrow on Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.